And begin when ready.
Okay, hi. My name is Katie O'Donnell, and my presentation is on the effects of teaching methods on adolescent dancers and non-dancers. So the dance industry would be nothing without its teachers. However, not all teachers are created equal. There are many institutions and studios and teachers that perpetuate a long history of dancer mistreatment. Along with that, there's also a stigma around non-dancers, either them themselves believing that they started too late, or other people believing that they started too late to thrive in the industry. And they often experience the feeling of being ostracized or develop mental health issues because of this. And it can also, these two problems can make dance less accessible, interesting, and make people unengaged in dance classes. So my research question was, how do adolescent dancers and non-dancers react to certain teaching techniques while learning choreography? And for some key terms, for my study, an adolescent was somebody ages 13 to 18. A non-dancer is someone who does not participate in any kind of dance. And a dancer is someone who takes at least one dance class or participates in some kind of organized dance outside of that, which can be cultural or religious or anything like that. And then my next three key terms, which are important to the study, is verbal teaching, which is spoken instruction, physical teaching, which is demonstration with the body, and metaphorical teaching, which is like a more figurative language kind of way to translate movement. And so my hypothesis for my question was that non-dancers have no previous experience picking up choreography, so they will rely more on their ability to see things as presented to them, so focusing more on that verbal and physical kind of teaching. And current dancers were expected to seek other ways of learning and channel more musicality, so maybe leaning more toward metaphorical kinds of teaching. And so my significance for this research is that there have been no direct findings about dancers or non-dancers and how they learn best in an environment like a studio. And my study was done not only to find the difference between the non-dancers and dancers, but to see what works for everybody and how teachers can create a welcoming and productive space for everybody. Okay, so for my method of inquiry, there are two parts. The first part was the experiment part. I had 4 separate trials at my studio, which is Richmond Dance Center, and they had dancers and non-dancers, some were a mix, and they all filled out an informed consent form, also by their parents, and a studio liability release form, just in case if anything happens. And then for the actual class, they were all the same for all 4 trials, and they consisted of 3 sections, which was warm-up, learn the choreography, and then we split into groups so they could watch each other and learn that way. And so the second part, after the class, a survey was issued via QR code and had preliminary questions like what was your age, if you're a dancer or non-dancer, if you were a dancer, how often, and then there were 7 questions determining whether certain techniques were helpful using the Likert scale. So for me, a 1 was strongly disagree, a 5 was strongly agree, and people chose based on that scale. And then the next 5 questions were open-ended, and they were about how participants learned best. It was more broad and elicited more open responses. So my sample size justification, the large enough sample condition states that if n is equal to or greater than 30, it is generally enough if normally distributed, and then the central limit theorem assumes the same thing. If n equals greater or to 30, it is generally big enough to have a normal distribution. So these things working in tandem gave me enough people for my study. So for my quantitative data, we can go ahead. So those Likert scale questions that I was talking about, the first question, okay. The first 3 questions asked, I find the use of verbal, physical, or metaphorical instruction helpful in learning choreography, in separate questions. And this is what the participants' average response is. Obviously, there's not a lot of variation between these answers from the Likert scale, so 1 through 5. A lot of the dancers were strongly, liked all of them, as well as the non-dancers, so there wasn't much statistical difference between them. For the chi-square test, I ran those with those averages, and I ran the chi-square test with those averages, and the null hypothesis that I had was that there is no partiality or no difference between the dancers and non-dancers in their answers, right? Because I was comparing the two. But the alternative hypothesis was that there was some kind of partiality. So after running this chi-square test, as you can see, both of their p-values were 0.99, which is really far away from 0, which means that there was kind of no partiality between both of the groups. If we have our 95% confidence, basically just says there's no statistical difference between them. And so for the next two questions, I asked whether personal comments or general comments were helpful in teaching. And like a personal comment would be like, participant X, make sure you straighten your arm. And a general comment would be like, hey, let's make sure we're all straightening our arms. So that's kind of the difference. And again, here we can see that these two intervals, so blue is personal, orange is general, they both encapsulate 0, and they're kind of close. So that kind of means, again, there's no difference. And because the true difference in the mean is really close to the center, again, there's only a difference. And then for the interval of observations, this one's even worse. You can see that they're very close. But that just means that like the dancers and the non-dancers had similar answers. And if you ran most of these tests over and over again, that you would find that they'd have the similar kind of responses from both groups. Despite all of that numerical data not having a lot of differences between the two groups, the qualitative data was much more helpful in determining any kind of differences between groups. So my first open-ended question, okay, so I had another figure, but it was in my paper as a big, long graph, which I could not put in this presentation. So instead, I'm just going to read the questions and say what both groups generally liked for each one. So the first question, out of physical, verbal, and metaphorical instruction, which do you find the most helpful in learning choreography and why? 14 dancers preferred physical instruction, and 2 only liked verbal. One of the dancers said, quote, I find physical most helpful in learning choreography because I can process it in my head better. 9 non-dancers favored physical, making it the majority for both groups, which was really big. The second question, what specific elements or examples of physical instruction do you find helpful in your learning process? Dancers mentioned a lot of repetition frequently and the appreciation for floor work. And floor work is just when you're dancing on the floor. That's all it is. And one dancer said, quote, I find floor work demos most helpful because it is the most complicated, which is what most people found as well. The non-dancers mentioned straight observation the most as their favorite physical instruction. Quote, having someone do the choreography was helpful and worked as a guide of what I was supposed to do. So the third question, what specific elements of verbal instruction were the most helpful? And the majority of dancers wrote that the use of detail and specific instruction was helpful. One dancer said, quote, the explanation of which leg goes where and what foot to step on helps me learn. And multiple non-dancers reported that linking different moves to lyrics in the song was really helpful. Like when an arm moves, it's on this specific lyric. However, 2 non-dancers did not like verbal instruction at all. The fourth question, what specific elements or examples of metaphorical instruction do you find the most helpful? 4 dancers appreciated hug and ceiling analogy that I used. So basically when I did this, I was like, that's like a hug. Or like this, I was like, you're like a ceiling, because it worked with the lyrics. Yeah, so 4 dancers appreciated that, but 1 stated that they did not like metaphors at all. And the non-dancers had similar responses, especially like the hug metaphor, they really liked that. However, 3 participants did not like metaphorical instruction at all either, which was not surprising, because metaphorical instruction can be a little bit hard when you're first learning choreography. And then the last question, were there any specific teaching techniques or strategies that stood out to you as effective in helping you learn choreography? And the most commonly reported technique of dancers was lyric association, which is a mix of verbal and metaphorical teaching. And someone said, quote, the use of lyrics rather than specific counts was really helpful to understand dance and get the timing right. And the non-dancer's majority answer was repetition and breaking up movement into sections. So instead of teaching one long phrase, it was broken up into like 10 seconds. So my results supported an article that I had in my paper, which concluded that multimodal teaching is essential to dance instruction. And multiple participants stated that a mix of 2 or more was actually the most helpful. Obviously, the quantitative data didn't give me a lot of information as to how those 2 groups differed. However, one commonality between both of them was that they preferred a mix of both, or all 3 kinds of instruction. And these findings can be applied more holistically and universally to dance pedagogy, as well as classroom teaching and other ways of teaching, because obviously the dance studio is not one place that we learn everywhere. And so if we realize that multimodal teaching is helpful in everyday learning, that can make our students more productive, our teachers more productive, no matter what kind of teacher they are. And for my conclusion, the quantitative Likert scale data collected didn't find any significant differences, right? But my qualitative data gave me so much more insight. And the dancers typically favored physical and metaphorical instruction, and non-dancers preferred verbal instruction paired with observation and repetition. Some of the limitations of this study was that I had a small participant pool, although 30 did fit the central limit theorem. It was still a pretty small pool, and there was also the issue of self-reporting bias. Some people could have been like, oh, what does Katie want me to put on this form? Like, what does she want me to say? What is more culturally better? Like, maybe I should say physical. Maybe she wants me to say physical. That was the thing. Also, some people did not answer my open-ended responses very well. Some people said, quote, nothing, or quote, it was good, which is not very insightful. So if I had more people, that would also kind of reduce that, because there would have been more answers to analyze. And another big limitation was that dancers lacked the knowledge of dance terminology. So when you have a dancer in a dance class, when you say, like, do a round de jambe, they know what that means. But for a dancer, they don't, so they would, you would assume that they would generally kind of go toward, like, physical, because they would have to look at you to understand, and not just, like, be like, oh, I know what a round de jambe is. And so my future directions, we could have a more longitudinal study and kind of see how people's preferences for teaching techniques change over time, especially in like rehearsal processes, because that's something that happens a lot in dance, is that, you know, you go to rehearsal to performance, and we could see how that changes over time. And we could also look at technique and choreography retention, and how different teaching techniques help students kind of retain choreography better, again, over time. And something else we could look at is performance quality, which is kind of similar, but again, how that changes over time, and if any kind of different teaching techniques help build a dancer's performance quality. Actually, go back for a second, sorry. Dance is ever changing, it is continuing to grow. Obviously, no 2 dancers or non-dancers are alike, and these findings are enlightening to just the basic idea of multimodal teaching, and can change harmful practices and stereotypes and all that kind of things that are presented in dance classes and in studios. And diversity and inclusion is great in this, and can be used within methods to allow the dance community to evolve and change and preserve the dance industry.
Thank you very much. At this point, panel, we have about 5.5 minutes for our panel questions.
How did your review of the methods used by scholars in the field inform your selection of a research method or process that is aligned with your research question and project goal?
Yeah, so one of the methods that I found that I wanted to do was like a survey at the end of my study after the class. And I used like a survey monkey. I found it was great. It was like a teacher evaluation, and it was for arts evaluation specifically. It was like a theater teacher, and I was like, this is great. So I kind of modeled my survey after that, having like the preliminary questions, the Likert scale questions, and then open-ended questions at the end. And then I also have a source somewhere in here. Oh yeah, the analysis of students' emotions in agreement with the dance technique used was used in like a European Journal of Human Movement. And that also helped me kind of shape kind of how I made the open-ended questions, and because they kind of asked the participants like as they were dancing how they felt about different things, like their emotions, their feelings. And so I kind of took that and was like, I'm going to do that for specific teaching techniques, and that really helped me kind of build the survey part of my site.
Next panel.
How do your findings provide directions for future research?
Yeah, if we go back to my, yeah. So kind of like I talked about, I think knowing that multimodal teaching is helpful. Again, can make us kind of look at longer studies, but it can also just evaluate what is happening in studios as of right now, because I know, like personally, and I had some research on this too, a lot of like ballet teachers specifically, who are like, have language barriers and stuff like that, would use their hands a lot. So like, they'd be like, here, this is, you know, en pas, this is what you do at the bar. But for some people, that's not helpful, because if they're a verbal kind of person and they're doing this, they can't really, students may not be able to take that information and use it to the best of their abilities. So if we kind of take this information and tell teachers that, hey, we need to switch it up, we need to use different kinds of techniques, that can be really helpful in the application like in the real world.
Given the limitations that you came across, if you could revisit your research process, what would you do differently and why?
Okay, well, I would definitely try and recruit people for my study earlier. That was a big issue that I had. Like, I had the studio availability because I had to kind of coordinate that with my, the head of my dance studio. But I would definitely kind of like advertise it more. So I had more people, so I had better answers. Yeah, I mean, overall, I feel like it went pretty well, but I definitely would try to get more people. That would be my biggest thing.
And we have approximately a minute and a half for any follow-up questions from the panel.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question. You mentioned implications for like education more broadly. Can you expand on that a little bit? Like, how do you think this sort of rolls over to education as a field, like in all kinds of ways?
Well, I obviously didn't do my study on like classroom teaching, but like as a student, I know that sometimes some things that teachers do don't work all the time. Like sometimes teachers straight lecturing isn't gonna work for all students, or teachers who like just do, I don't know, like more like game type things or like more hands-on. That also might not work for somebody. They might not soak in that information. So I think knowing that and knowing that dancers are wanting to gravitate toward multimodal teaching, I think it's pretty safe to say that that would also work in a classroom just from personal experience and seeing other people learn. So that's how I think.
Excellent. We are out of time for follow-up questions for this presenter. Thank you very much.